Welcome to another focus session of the Aviasis Foundation, the online TV show in which we inform, inspire and entertain African aviation safety. We look at what's relevant in the African aviation safety domain, and we talk to inspiring professionals that work on improving safety. So today our guest is Robert Jensen from Kenyon, the biggest disaster management company in the world. It's a pity, Robert, that you've recently moved back to the US, because we had hoped to have you in the studio here and do the interview live. Now we're on a Zoom call, but still an interesting Zoom call with great backgrounds on both sides, I think. And we'd love to talk with you in this session about some of the lessons that you have learned and that Kenyon as a company has learned in the last 115 years of your existence, which is pretty impressive. And as an anchor, we'll use the book that you've recently published called Personal Effects. It's a great book. I've read it myself, I can honestly say. I really enjoyed it, although it's quite grim at points, of course, because of the type of work that you do. So let me hand it over to you, Robert, for a brief introduction of yourself and of what Kenyon does.
Great. Thank you, Tom. And although I enjoy being back in the States, I loved living in Europe, and in studio interviews, I think, are always a little bit better, but we have to adapt to the new normal of Zoom.
That's right.
As you said, I've been with Kenyon, and Kenyon's been in business since 1906. And our job is to respond to mass fatalities. In aviation, that's often a loss of an aircraft. And our job is really to do a couple things. It's to help build a bridge with our airline partners, a bridge for the living to cross. It's a bridge that spans from what was normal to what will be normal for the families and the survivors post-accident or post-incident. And that bridge built with the airline partners, with the airline emergency managers, the airline CEOs, the insurers, and the government agencies that are responding, is to allow people to process what has occurred, and most importantly for them, to know what to expect, to know what's next. We also have a job for the dead. Now we can't make it better, because we can't bring back the dead and we can't uninjure people. The best we can do is zero, but what we can do is ensure that there is dignity for the deceased, that they have an identity, a name. And in doing that, we can help the living to go forward. And that means responding to do some key things: the family assistance, a call center, how we work with the media partners, and working directly with those survivors and families to explain everything that's going to happen about settlements, about accident investigation, the return of their loved ones, the return of their loved ones' property, so that they can go forward in life. It'll be a different life. Mm-hmm. And how well we as responders do that determines how hard or how easy it is for most of those people. So that's what we at Kenyon do, and that's what I do. Now, for me, this isn't academic.
No.
I'm 56 years old. And in my lifetime, I've been to two events that have killed each over 250,000 people, or close to 250,000 people.
Yeah.
In the time it took for most people to have a cup of coffee. And that was the Boxing Day tsunami in 2004 and the Haitian earthquake in January 2010. I don't even count the number of aircraft accidents anymore.
You've been involved in.
So this isn't something that I think about if it happens. It is going to happen. We're human and we make mistakes. What we don't know is where and when it will happen. And so that's why it's incumbent upon everyone in this industry to be prepared.
Great. Thanks, Robert, for that introduction. Actually, let's take a look at a short video from Kenyon that explains that in visual images as well.
Since 1906, Kenyon has been here responding to some of the world's worst events. We've been here to help our clients prepare for and manage and respond to those events. We do that by focusing on caring for the people directly affected. From the moment we receive your call, as your partner, we're going to start launching our resources, our logistics, our people, our systems, activating our call center, getting our family assistance teams up and running, having our crisis comms people on the phone with you. We're going to be there for the incident, for the year, the 18 months afterwards, helping you manage that event. Rely on Kenyon to be prepared when you need it most.
So, Robert, that was a more detailed insight also in what Kenyon does as a company. Now, you spoke of the fact that for you this is not a theoretical exercise, and that actually resonates really well with aviassist, because aviassist is very much and has been very much about providing practical steps to improve aviation safety, mostly in our case. So let's perhaps explore some of those practical steps that people can find in your book, which I find a fascinating read. I felt that the first three-quarters of the book was almost like a training manual, I guess. There were so many golden steps in there, I think. And of course, I'm not an ERP professional, not an emergency response professional, but that made it really enjoyable. And it meant that every page I turned, I learned something about your profession, which is nice on an individual level to learn what you do, but it's also great for me and aviassist to get a better idea of how emergency response can be improved in Africa. Now, one of the recurring themes in your book is that you cannot control the accident because that has happened, but you can control the response. Are there certain things that you can perhaps give to our audience, African airlines, African airports, in terms of, what are some of those improvements in that control of the response they could implement?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for your very kind comments on the book. And I mean, and this is why I think we like so much working with you, Tom, and aviassist, is because you do focus on safety. And I would love for Kenyon to be out of business because we focus on the consequences. We're not so much in prevention. I mean, we have some safety people that, of course, work with your teams and our clients. But because accidents do happen, there needs to be that response and preparation. And one of the first things that I would tell people, or I tell people when I do face-to-face training, is that you have to accept that this could happen. And when it does happen, you can't focus on the event itself. It's like it's like trying to diffuse a bomb that's already exploded. Instead, you have to focus on responding and managing the consequences, because a family's first call is not to their lawyer or to the media. A family's first call is to you as an airline executive or the airline people for help. They're not coming to you to blame you. They're coming to you to ask for help because they haven't been through this. And so it's really important that you first understand it could happen. Secondly, let the investigation work itself, go through the investigation process, but don't make that the immediate focus. Make the immediate focus caring for the people involved. That's what makes the difference between a successful response and a bad response. And a successful response means that you have those plan and resources to deal with some key areas. The key areas, first of all, the family assistance. Can you set up a family assistance center and help people? And what does it mean by help people? It simply means give them a place to come, tell them what to expect, make sure your insurance broker, your insurance company is there to explain the process to help families on what's next for immediate assistance and settlement. Litigation doesn't have to occur. I use the phrase in the book, litigation is an extension of rage. When we see people sue and we see people pursue aggressive litigation, it's because they're angry. The amount of settlement really isn't debatable. Mm-hmm. It's pretty much established by accountants before an accident never occurs. The challenge is when we do a bad job, we make people angry, so they don't want to talk to us. The second thing, besides having that family assistance capability set up and ready to go, is understanding some practical things that you need to immediately do. Offer assistance to the government, because what they do will have an impact on you. So by that assistance, can you bring in a team to help with forensics? Can you help with the personal effects? This digging a hole, burying everything, or telling people that can't be done doesn't exist. It's not realistic. There are resources to help with the recovery, identification, and return of the deceased and the personal effects. It's a government requirement, but the governments will need assistance. The families aren't going to judge the government. They're going to judge you as an airline. And then When we work with families, what about communication?
Hmm.
We need to be able to do some key things right away. Our sympathy letters, but those need to be drafted ahead of time so that the lawyers, your insurer, your PR people can make sure that everyone's accustomed to the words and the terms, and most importantly, the tone we're going to use.
Yeah.
The same with our press releases.
So Robert, if I can just take you to that point you made about litigation, because I guess that's something quite often people all fear, and myself being an aviation and space lawyer by training, I know that part of the equation. But in some of the previous interviews you've done, amongst others, the CEO panel with IATA a few years back, there was this discussion about should one of the first things that you do as an airline be to say you're sorry? And then sometimes people say, well, you shouldn't, because that'll mean it's a mission of guilt almost. But what I find fascinating in your book is I get the impression that you say establishing that emotional link and putting the victim's family first is really crucial. And that's also where that sorry comes in. Is that a correct understanding of your experience indeed?
Oh, absolutely. And I've responded to accidents in some of the most litigious regions of the world. And I'll give you a good example, Tom. The Alaska Airlines 261, which crashed back in 2000 in the United States, or pardon me, 2001 in January, or 2000 in January. This was an MD-80, and it took off from Mexico going to San Francisco with a final destination, Seattle. Had 88 people on board, 33 of which were airline employees or non-revenue travel. And the plane had a problem with the elevator, and the elevator failed, and the plane crashed despite everything that the pilot could do to save it. It just wasn't possible. And there were some maintenance issues with the airline that were quite public quite quickly, including a potential grand jury investigation. And the CEO came down to the Family Assistance Center, and he said he was sorry for the loss. And he said he was going to have to focus on what to do going forward because he couldn't undo the past. And if you look at the stock price of Alaska Airlines, it's done very well. And this was a hometown airline. This was a favorite airline, a flag carrier of the region, if you would, much like African airlines that represent both the country and the people.
Mm-hmm.
And so the family said, we understand there's mistakes. There's going to have to be accountability. And that settlement will occur. But now we know we can talk to you. And that's what the families are looking for. They're not looking for the name of a corporation. They're looking for a human being who says, I'm sorry for your loss. Not that says, I'm taking responsibility or accepting fault, but says, I'm sorry that you were here. I'm sorry that your loved one is deceased. And now I'm here to help you go forward. And if you look at 9/11, for example, again in the United States, and I use the US because it's a very litigious country. The last settlements for the last cases for 9/11 didn't hinge on a dollar amount because, again, that dollar amount is really kind of fixed. They hinged on the security company CEOs and the airline CEOs meeting with the families and saying they're sorry. And those should have been the first things that were done. And I've done those briefings in Africa. I've done them in the Middle East. I've done them in Europe. I've done them in the US. And I can tell you there is a very distinct change in the response that the family members have when that CEO or senior person from the airline, when he or she stands up and says, I'm here. Yeah, I'm here to go forward for you. And I'm sorry that this has occurred.
So that's almost the first step. I mean, in the book you speak a lot about, and you mentioned it in this session as well, helping people, helping companies cross that bridge with this humongous hole that all of a sudden appeared in their life or in their company. So that's where it basically starts, at this very early point where you have this communication ready indeed. Now, one of the things I also picked up from some of the other conversations is that you mention, this initial communication is important. The first hour is very important, the golden 1 or 2 hours, and people train for that a lot. But the response, I guess, also from an airline or an airport also changes after that, right? On the longer term, the type of communication has to change as well. What suggestions could you give there?
Oh, absolutely. So think of it in phases. So the initial phase is, I'm sorry this has happened. Here's who I am. Very brief, very specific, and very focused. Then we start to go to processes, because families haven't been through this, the processes, and we do this with a family website. Here's the investigation process. The investigators talk about the investigation. An airline or airport doesn't, but they can explain what the process is because people don't understand, and then give examples. How long is this going to take? I do briefings all the time, and I use a relevant example. For Egypt Air 804, I spoke about Swiss Air 111 or Egypt Air 990 and said these were multi-year investigations. So if you're hearing people talk about what they think has occurred, that's speculation. Let me give you real examples. And then families can start to do some research. Families can start to get an idea. So most importantly, they can plan. So we move from this has happened, we're sorry, and we're going to be here, to now let me explain what to expect in the process. And then it becomes more specific to each family and their situation. Let me talk about the return of your loved one's property. Let me talk about the return of your loved one. Let's talk about a 1-year anniversary, or if we need to, a mass grave. So it goes from kind of a big picture, bottom of a pyramid, to the pointy end of the pyramid, very specific. And also it's important to remember that over time, that communication transitions because families will start to have their attorneys to deal with the specifics. And then the airline will have their attorneys deal with the specifics. It's important that that tone, though, stays the same because the airline needs to get focused on running their airline, taking care of business, fixing
When you
any
say
problems
the
they
tone has to
may
stay
have
the
had.
same, what do you mean? In which way does the tone have to stay the same?
The tone has to stay the same, not as bureaucratic, not as process or system driven, but as people driven. So when we write to a family, we don't say, oh, we're sorry about, the loss of your family members or people. We say, we're sorry about the loss of so-and-so. We personalize it. We make sure that the family always knows that when we're talking to them, we're talking to them about a specific person.
That's relevant to them. That means a lot in their life, indeed. That creates.
Absolutely. You're not number 100 out of 150.
Another thing, actually, maybe, Robert, just to get this clear, because people might think, well, this sounds perfect. I want that service, and whenever a disaster happens, I'll give Kenyon a ring. Is that how it works, or do you have a membership, or how does that work, if you don't mind me asking?
Yeah, well, first of all, there's no magic wand. There's no magic pill. These things are hard to do, and they're a lot of work, and there are a lot of long hours. But that's what you sign up to do when you run an airline and you have a loss. How Kenyon works is that you have to have an agreement with Kenyon prior to an incident. And you do that by paying a retainer for the 1, 2, 3, or 4 services that you want. And that way we can work with you to make sure that there's mutual understanding of what to expect. Understanding we're not the cavalry that comes in and says, we're here to save the day.
Yeah.
We're coming in to help you. We're going to give you advice. But unlike a lot of consultants or people who give advice, I'm not going to tell a CEO, well, you have to go talk to families. Good luck. I'm going to tell a CEO, you're going to have to talk to families, but we're going to be standing right there next to you. We're going to be helping you talk to the families because we're also going to be talking to the families. Mm-hmm. We're going to be there with you to go through this. And then there's some training because I think a lot of people still in the industry need help in understanding the difference between an academic response and all the exercises we do and the real world response. And Tom, I'll give you an even better example. I love to go into airlines that have emergency response plans that are these big, thick binders. Mm-hmm. They're several inches or centimeters thick. And I tell people I love these type of plans because I take them and I use them to hold the door open on the crisis center because it's usually very hot and stuffy in there.
Yeah, because they're academic as opposed to pragmatic and empathetic to the specific situation of the occasion.
Yeah, or a checklist. We need to train people. We need to think about what if this is this person's second day on the job. They're not going to have time to read a binder and memorize it because it's not something they do every day.
No.
It needs to be a checklist to say, I need to do A, B, C, D, and E, and this is how I do it.
So you'd be much more impressed in that respect if you'd find a good thought-out checklist in an ERP room somewhere than this couple of inches thick book, basically.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Because they don't work. Because the one thing that you will never have enough of in an incident is time. And as a responder, I use the example when I was a policeman, I would get an emergency call and I could be there and to me, right away. And the first thing the person would say to me is, "What took you so long?" And so for a family, time moves slowly. For them, an hour can seem like 12 hours. And for a responder, time moves the opposite. You look at your watch at noon, you think it's 1 o'clock, and it's now midnight.
Hmm.
So there are some physiological or psychological things that you also have to understand when you respond. And so you want to give yourself the best advantage to be successful. So clear checklists. And checklists that have to be another thing I see with carriers, and this is true in Africa like everywhere else in the world, there are so many people involved that you can't do your part if you don't train and exercise with your partners.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's where the training comes in that you said that Kenyon also provides indeed to its customers indeed. So if I can just take you back to that communication part, Robert, one thing which I found interesting in your book also is that you speak of the importance, if you can, to try and involve the media as your partner. And I guess that possibly might mean that you have to start developing a relationship with those media before the accident, before an accident happens. Now, I guess in Africa, the major carriers like Kenya Airways, Rwanda Air, Ethiopian, they'll have social media teams, of course. But I think it's quite promising to see that even smaller carriers like ProFlight in Zambia, like SafariLink in Kenya, have this presence on the social media and with the media. Is that something that you've seen works positive if you have that existing relationship with the media in your country before an accident takes place?
Oh, absolutely. And one of the things I love about African aviation is a lot of the newer carriers, the up and coming carriers, have some really great young staff people, and they get it. They're on the internet, they're on Twitter, they're on Facebook, and they are communicating. They're searching for things, they're talking to people, and they understand their audience. And so when you have a loss, there can be a philosophy to close everything down, shut the door, and you don't want to do that. This is the best way for you to communicate with people and give information. And that's what people are desperate for. Not about what occurred, but about what's going forward. So yes, having that relationship beforehand is absolutely important, because one of the things you're going to do, or we're going to suggest you do, and we're going to help you do, and we've done it, since 2013. In fact, going back to Lamb, Mozambique, we set up a family website. And I'll tell you as an example, you know who the biggest argument against a family website was?
No.
Who do you think, Tom?
Maybe suing again, people, information that was out there that wasn't going to be litigated with.
It was the insurer, and part of it was part of the team at the airline. Part of the team said, this is great. Part of the team said it isn't. But you think about it. We had people from 4 or 5 different countries, different continents, all looking for information. And so what's the best way to give it to them? You put it on the web in their language. You write it in a very straightforward place. And you don't put private information about a specific person. It's what to expect again. Here's the things that have occurred.
Next step in the process.
And families loved it because they could see pictures. Wow, here's a picture of the facility. Here's a picture of the team that's working. Now I see there's a lot of people coming together to help take care of this response.
Yeah.
And what people see with social media is they see people. It's not a formal bureaucratic communication that I don't know what to believe. Instead, here is something that's heartfelt. Here's something that's human.
Empathy, yeah.
And so, there's a lot of great work being done by those carriers. The key is it's just got to make sure that the information is consistent, and that when we talk about marketing, we really have a message we're trying to give. When we talk about a response, we have information, and we have to make sure that the information is clear and not ambiguous. which sometimes marketing can be very,
Geared.
have many meanings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, I think also, as an aviation brotherhood and sisterhood in Africa, we probably also have to do a better job at training the press, because at the moment, very often, press people in Africa receive very little training about safety, about aviation. And so then they start making their own stories. It's the same thing, again, like you're saying, it's basically being unprepared for the response. So I think that's also something we as Aviassist, within our capabilities, have to work on. We have been involved with perhaps trying to start an African Aviation Journalism Society, to train those people, not just obviously for disasters, but I think it can certainly help. Now, you also mentioned in your conversation today, but also in the book, the change that took place, particularly in the US, I think it was 1996, when a new law was put into place, which sort of put the survivors and the family first, as opposed to the insurance company thinking they know what was best for the people on the outside world. Have you seen perhaps in the cases you've mentioned, like Mozambique and other places in Africa, would it help us if we try to lobby for similar legislation in African jurisdictions, you think?
Yeah, well, there's a couple things. So the U.S. laws occurred because there were some horrific crashes, and the law didn't focus on the crash; it focused on the response and the really poor and horrible responses. And then ICAO picked up the ball and said, "Look, we probably need to do the same thing, but we can't make a law; we can make guidance." And several countries have now put laws into place following the U.S. law or the ICAO guidance. Africa is a bit behind, and the responses in Africa are hit and miss. There have been some very good responses with caring for families. Now, parochially speaking, I'd say those were the ones that Kenyon were involved in. Unfortunately, there's been some really horrible responses. With the recent loss, or a few years ago with the Boeing 737 MAX, that was a horrible response. The emails I got from families were very critical of. We weren't involved, but asking questions, because I actually had family members who had family members in other losses and saying, I don't understand the difference.
The difference between them.
And so, yes, yeah, absolutely. Well, you see a crash site that's not secure, you see empty caskets going home, you see, people wandering around the site. So I think family assistance laws would be good, but it shouldn't take a law, because here's the thing. A good response is cheaper for the airline and the insurer than a bad response, because a bad response eats up a lot of money in litigation, reputation, and what people perceive as an airline. And are African carriers better or worse than other carriers? Well, you can look at the statistics, but if you actually take the statistics and say, let me look at the passenger liners, let me look at the age of the new aircraft, let me look at what they're doing for safety, there's some really good carriers in Africa, but they suffer because they don't do a good job in communication, and they allow a government without experience to kind of direct a response when they can take a more proactive role
In that.
And yeah, absolutely. Because what eventually is going to happen is you will find countries saying, we're not there yet, but I think, Tom, it's coming, where you're going to find countries saying, look, if you're going to respond to an accident like this, we're not going to let you fly into our country. And you can look at the United States, where Asiana had their accident in San Francisco and was fined $500,000, not because of the accident, but because of the response and the lack of family assistance.
So that'll be a driver from the other side, indeed, where countries start demanding those kind of systems being in place for those airlines. So one thing which also...
Absolutely.
Yeah, go ahead.
Absolutely. And the point I'd make with that, Tom, is countries are really reaching out to try to do a better job at protecting their citizens abroad. And you have some countries now that have ambassadors that do nothing but go around when there's been a disaster or an incident to look after their citizens very specifically. So I think that is a change for some countries.
And perhaps especially now with Corona, of course, which meant that many more countries had to deal with their citizens being abroad and having to be repatriated, indeed, whether they were survivors or unfortunate casualties indeed. So if I can just take you back to this, the role of surviving a disaster as an airline and getting your reputation, preserving your reputation wherever possible. In all fairness, when I first heard of the fact that ERP, emergency response planning, was part of the safety management system, I was a bit puzzled, myself. Again, I told you I'm a simple lawyer in that respect. I thought, how can this domain of, when everything has gone wrong in terms of safety, namely emergency response, how can that be part of a safety management system? But if I hear you now as well, it seems you also say it's also crucial if you think of the fact that an airline is there not to, safety first is not really true. It's about making a profit if you can, of course. That's the purpose of the company and providing a service.
It's a business.
So it's a business indeed. So this response and having this ERP as part of your safety management is also crucial in surviving this as an airline or an airport.
Absolutely. A crash occurring doesn't have to put you out of business. If you look in Chinese, a crisis is actually made up of the word dangerous opportunity. Companies that can manage a crisis, and what type of crisis is worse than a loss of life, than 100 people or 50 people or 20 people or 200 people being killed? If a business can manage that type of crisis, what can't they manage? And here's the thing, they're really not that hard. I mean, I was a deputy sheriff, an Army officer. I don't think I'm, I couldn't do what you do. I wouldn't have passed to be an attorney. So I don't think it's, or solicitor, as you call it. I don't think it's that hard. It's scary and it needs some experience, but there are people, that's why we use the people we use. They have experience to help guide. It's really just about remembering that as a human being, after all, you're a fellow human being. And it's not doing for you what I think should be done. It's doing for you what I know should be done as one person caring for next. And so that's a little bit of syntax there, because you don't want to put your cultural values or your religion or your beliefs. But what you want to do is have the normal compassion I think so many of us see and are born with, as the normal compassion to say, I want to help you get through this hard time. Here's what I think is going to happen, or here's what I know is going to happen. Yeah. So let me kind of paint you a picture, and then you have to tell me how you want to go through it. And so for carriers, it's not hard. Now, safety is a little bit different, because safety people are very, very specific. There's a system that's not going to fail.
Yeah.
And so that's why emergency planners have to be part of that, and they have to work together. And from a practical standpoint, Tom, there are some really great things you can see in a response, you can learn in a response, that you can make changes right away in your own company.
Yeah, that will
so that
business processes and your safety, for that matter, indeed.
Yeah, absolutely. We had an accident that occurred where there was one fatality. And during the autopsy, we noticed that there were no seatbelt marks, and he was not recovered wearing a seatbelt. And this was a plane that flew over some very scenic areas, and all the passengers moved to the windows and coming for landing. So part of this is, look, there's probably going to be a line in the final report a year from now or 2 years from now about this passenger not wearing a seatbelt. You make an announcement to wear a seatbelt, but because of where you fly, it's so beautiful, people are really focused on the windows.
Yeah.
Maybe one of your training procedures should be a positive check, where you have a crew member walk up and down the aisle of the aircraft.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so this way, when the report comes out, you as an airline can say, you know what, we didn't have to, but we want to take care of our passengers, so we've already made a change. Mm-hmm. So there are really some good tie-ins.
And I think what I really liked is not so much a question actually as a comment from your book, is how much detail and how much time you spend on trying to explain things like the autopsies, identification of victims, because you speak of this CSI effect, where people expect the answer to those questions within hours or a couple of weeks. Maybe you could also call it the Amazon effect nowadays. People expect next day delivery, basically. So I thought that was very fascinating to have a little insight into how some of that identification process works. So thanks for that. In the book, you also speak actually of the need for this rapid communication. We spoke about it before in this session as well. Now, I can imagine that if there's an operator watching that's not the size of Kenya Airways or Ethiopian, that they may think this is all fine and nice, but I don't have the means to set up a communications system that is as big as I would need for a major catastrophe. Have you seen examples where perhaps operators in a particular region or a particular country start pooling resources for that purpose? So they say, okay, let's jointly do something on that?
I have, and it's a great concept, but it doesn't work because it goes back to insurance and solicitors. Everyone talks about wanting to give. And if you remember years ago, there was a foundation set up where every airline was going to help each other until an event really occurred, and then no airline will give their people up to be involved in another airline because it's an additional risk. So it's great to have joint training, but you really have to be staffed for response. But that's where Kenyon, our model, was to create that surge capacity. And you'd actually be surprised, during the Germanwings response to Germanwings, the flight that the co-pilot purposely crashed into the mountains.
Yeah.
Kenyon was heavily involved, and this is for a major carrier with far more people than we have. But bigger companies also have bureaucracies, which can make it hard to move quickly that smaller companies don't have. So being small or large really doesn't give you an advantage, because what you need is very critical skill sets to help. Where a company really is involved is at the leadership and making quick decisions and making sure that people are working together and that they're focusing on all the things they have to focus on. And that means the team that's doing the response, and that could be with your partners like Kenyon,
Mm-hmm.
and then your team that's also running your company, because you don't want to take people out, because you still have to do flights. People still want to fly.
Yeah.
People are going to say that's sad and tragic, but I've still got my trip, so I need to catch my flight. And then you have your employees and making sure that they have information. That's why one of the biggest things is communication. We know this event has occurred. What we now need to do is focus on what does it mean for us going forward, and how are we caring for people? And that way your current employees are focused.
Yeah, and how to deal
And some
with
of those,
indeed that's which I keep finding in the book, which I found very interesting. The concept of having to helping the survivors, the family, and the company cross that giant hole which has been caused in their life or their operations because of the crash. Indeed.
yeah.
Now, the training you provided for us a couple of years back in Zambia as Kenyon focused on the 12 principles of crisis management. Now, interestingly enough, I found hidden in your website somewhere, there used to be a course on that, which people could do online. I understand that's no longer live at the moment, but is that something you think Kenyon in the future might be entering into, providing short courses for people to do these things, to learn those things?
Absolutely. The goal was to create a unified online portal, because we're using a couple different systems. Online was not new, but it's still kind of newish. And so part of what the company's been doing has been creating some new content, new classes, and trying to establish a system that's much easier to access, look at different languages, and look at different media. And so that's in process right now. I'd like to give you data when it's going to come out. I don't have that,
We'll keep
but
pushing.
I would expect several of these classes to be back online. And the first two were going to be on the 12 principles and family assistance.
Okay, well, that's great to hear. We'll keep pushing Kenyon to try and work with us to make that accessible indeed to Africa.
Oh, absolutely.
I think, Robert, we're sort of coming to the close of our talk today. What I would like to focus on, and maybe I'll surprise you a bit with this, but we'd love to see, is there a way we can work with you, with Robert Jensen, with Kenyon, on working towards something like a little academy, a little trajectory in the center we're putting up in Rwanda and in other regions of Africa as well in the future to work on this, to train on this, the Robert Jensen Academy of Crisis Management, if you want, for example. Would that be something you would be interested in? You think Kenyon could be interested in?
Yeah, I absolutely think it's something that Kenyon will be interested in, and as I move forward, and I'm not a spring chicken. The good thing about experience is you have experience. The bad thing is over time, you don't want to be success isn't you doing everything. Success is leaving a legacy and training and building up people. And there's a lot of good younger people coming up in the world. And I think it's important to incorporate all of those. And yes, I think Kenyon as a company will certainly want to improve that, because here's the thing, it's self-serving in a way for us. People who are better trained and better prepared are easier to work with in an accident or incident. They don't have unrealistic expectations.
True.
And so it's kind of a self-serving thing here. And for myself, as I get ready to enjoy hobbies, enjoy things that I haven't been able to do, having been at the end of the phone, I do want to make sure the knowledge and the experience, because Tom, I look at it this way, there's a lot of minefields and minds hurt. And so if I can give you a map and some ideas so that you avoid the minefields, then the pain was not for nothing, so to speak.
Yeah. Well, I mean, speaking of legacy, Robert, I honestly think that your book, Personal Effects, is a part of that legacy as far as I see it. It's like I said, first of all, it's a fantastic read, but it's also full of these suggestions and tips and lessons that operators in Africa, whether they're airports, airlines, or smaller operators, can learn. So I think I want to thank you very much for this conversation today, Robert. I really enjoyed it to start with. Secondly, I think there's loads of lessons in this and your book for Africa to take home. So thanks so much for your time today. That brings us to the end of the session. I'm sure you and I will meet again, Robert, whether it's in Africa or in Bracknell or wherever it might be. Once again, thanks so much, and good luck on your side. And I think that brings us to the closing off this focus session. Any last remarks, Robert? You want to sling this way?
I just say you're welcome, Tom, and to keep up the great work. The more you do, the less we have to do.
That's very true. Right. Well, thanks so much, audience out there in Africa. I hope you enjoyed our conversation today with Robert Jensen. I certainly did. Once again, a great book which is out, which you can order online. We might have 1 or 2 copies available actually for lucky winners in Africa in the coming month. Thanks so much. I hope you enjoyed it, and have a great rest of your day.